Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Robert Jenrick, the Government's Secretary of State for Housing and Local Communities, former Treasury Minister under Theresa May. Labour's Shadow Housing Secretary, former Shadow Arts Minister, who resigned from the front bench over Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in 2016, Thangam Debbonaire. Joining us down the line, former Director of Pizza Express and founder of Punch Taverns, a UK-wide group of around 1,300 pubs, Hugh Osmond. Deborah Frances-White, comedian, writer and host of the award-winning podcast The Guilty Feminist, and former Conservative MP and Minister, known for his outspoken tenure as Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow. Good evening. Welcome to my guest here in the studio. Hugh, welcome to you, joining us down the line. And, of course, to our audience, QT50, many familiar faces, a couple of new ones tonight. Very good to see you. And, of course, welcome to you at home. Thank you very much for joining us. And do join in the conversation the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time. OK, our first question tonight is from Chris Oram.
Good evening, Fiona. Good evening, panel. Was the UK government right to send Royal Navy ships to Jersey amid tensions with French fishermen?
John?
No, it's an absurd act of gunboat diplomacy. It's a bit of jingoistic sabre rattling. And if you tell me, or anybody does tonight, that the dispatch of those ships and the fact of election day today are unrelated, I can say only that you will believe anything. It's juvenile, it's down market, it's not constructive, it doesn't advance the cause of the arguments that need to be resolved. And the truth of the matter is that the problem flows, as so many things persistently do, from Brexit. And with the detail, with the interstices of the system, with the specifics, negotiators have to deal. It isn't going to be addressed by a kind of Palmerstonian populism. And frankly, Britain can do better than that.
Robert.
Well, look, I'm pleased that the situation seems to have eased in Jersey. We've seen tonight that the ships have left the vicinity of Jersey, and we were right to do everything that we can to support Jersey, the people of Jersey, and the fishermen and women of Jersey.
Well, how are you going to convince John? Because he obviously feels very strongly.
Well, I don't think I'm ever going to convince John. John's views on Brexit are well known. They were well known when he was in the Speaker's chair.
The question is about sending Royal Navy ships to Jersey.
What we have done is make very clear to the French ministers, who said some, I think, very unwise and disproportionate comments, that we will stand with the people of Jersey. But John is right in the sense that this issue now needs to be resolved by diplomacy, by the Chief Minister and the Ministers of Jersey, with the support of the UK government, working with their counterparts in France and the European Union. There is an agreement which covers this issue. It allows Jersey to regulate fishing within its waters and enables them to have a licensing agreement. There seems to be some disagreement about the precise details of that. That now needs to be worked through in the usual way. But
when you say the way to work it through is diplomacy, I mean, the French Foreign Minister was in London yesterday.
Well,
could you not have had a conversation with him then?
Well, ministers have spoken with their counterparts in the French government. The Chief Minister and other ministers, like the Minister for External Affairs of Jersey, have spoken with their counterparts as well. And it sounds like a sensible outcome has been achieved tonight, because those ships have moved away. The Royal Navy is able to move away as well, although it will keep a watch on events. And we're going to ensure that this is sorted out as quickly as possible, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. On John's broader point about Brexit, look, I'm pleased that we have put those issues to bed. He and I were in the House of Commons together and saw how paralysing it was for the country. It was right that we sorted that out. We did that last year. Now we're moving forwards as a country.
Fish exports to the EU, I know this was the French, obviously, complaining, but fish exports to the EU from the UK were down 31%. So when you say you're glad this has been put to bed, that's hardly a result.
No, I'm glad that Brexit, a question which has divided and paralysed British politics for a long time, has been resolved.
But you can't be happy with that.
There are some issues to be ironed out relating to the agreement that we signed. We're doing that with respect to Northern Ireland. We're doing it now with respect to Jersey as well. But you're also beginning to see some of the benefits of Brexit, none more so than the vaccine programme, which has enabled us to roll out one, if not the world's most successful vaccine programme. And Michel Barnier himself, remember the chief negotiator...
We're getting quite far away from sending Royal Navy ships to Jersey
that the vaccine programme's success demonstrates, by contrast, the burdensome and bureaucratic nature of the EU, their inability to do the same. So I think people across the country are not only pleased that Brexit is finally put to bed, but also are beginning to see some of the very real benefits of being in control of our
Let's hear from some of those people around the country, because there's quite a few hands up in our audience. Carlos.
We don't have many details, and it will probably be a while till we get them. But it's obviously a failure of diplomacy, and it's a terrible tragedy that we're not getting on well at all with our next door neighbours, and we've already had to bring the dogs out to face each other off.
Okay, Steph.
The French's response wasn't very proportionate either. I mean, they were talking about cutting power off the whole island. I mean, that's not diplomatic either, is it? I mean, we do need to learn to talk. And I think that's been the biggest problem with Brexit as well. I mean, we clash too much. We've got to learn to start talking to our neighbours again. We've got to get on with them.
Steve?
Turn the question round. What on earth gave the French the right to suddenly start blockading a British port? The only mistake that the Royal Navy made was in not sinking the ships in the first place. It's an absolutely disgusting thing to have done, and to try to justify it by saying, well, we should have been diplomatic. Where were they? Shouldn't they have started a diplomacy?
Thangam?
Well, let's take this problem back to root causes. There was a trade and cooperation agreement that was negotiated very much at the last minute. In fact, I think we got it on Christmas Eve. And in that trade and cooperation agreement, there were many problems that were both predictable and indeed predicted. Let's take, for a start, the protocol on Northern Ireland, that there would be a border down the Irish Sea was entirely predictable and predicted. The fishing problem was also a predictable and predicted problem. And whilst I applaud the government's ability to try and defend the 24,000 jobs associated with the fishing industry, I'd like them to put a little bit of effort into the 2 million jobs in the creative industries that have been absolutely hammered.
Hang on, we're getting way off the question. Was the government right to send Hang on, Thangam, wait a minute. Was the government right to send Royal Navy ships to Jersey amid tensions with French fishermen? Were they right to do that?
My point, and it does relate to
what's the answer to the question?
Is if they were right, which I dispute, I think it's not a diplomatic way to resolve a difficulty. I'd far rather they were resorting to the traditional act of diplomacy, which is being diplomatic and talking. And as you said, the French were actually in the country yesterday. There was perfectly ample opportunities. But my point is that if they're going to do this, if they're going to send the gunships out for the fishing industry, they need to think very hard about how they're defending all the other industries that have suffered as a result of the content of the trade and cooperation agreement.
Hugh, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I just think it's a failure of diplomacy on both sides, isn't it? I mean, quite clearly, it should have been dealt with diplomatically, jaw, not war, as they say. Once that failed, who exactly was to blame for sending ships in where? You know, it's very difficult to say. Clearly, the French behaved badly. Whether our response was proportionate is difficult to say. It should have been dealt with a long time before it got to the situation of sending out gunboats, where there's clearly much higher priorities for the Royal Navy than floating around in Jersey. There's what's going on in the China Sea and around Russia, for example. So, you know, there's much higher priorities. It shouldn't have got to that.
I mean, the one thing for the French fishermen is that people are at least now paying attention to that. I mean, you wonder if Scottish fishermen who feel so betrayed by the Brexit deal, wonder if they should be they might be wondering if they should be taking a leaf out of the French fisher folks' book.
Well, I think that when people's livelihoods are put at risk, you have to expect them to make a bit of a stand. And I do respect that you know, the British fighting for fishing and the French fighting for their rights. But as I say, I think really, you know, in general, if you can achieve something by talking and negotiation, it is much better than sending gunships around the place.
Amanda?
I was reading about this actually this morning, and it seems to be that the fishermen from France are coming over because they're complaining that they haven't got their licenses, but they knew they had to get the licenses in January. It's no different than we were being told on a regular basis, make sure that you've got all your documentation sorted. I think there was an advert from the government on a daily basis stating that if you trade internationally, you've got to, your deadline is January, blah, blah, blah. I don't see why the governments in France and Germany and all the others didn't actually do the same thing. They should have had their paperwork in time. They obviously haven't, you know, and therefore they can't. Well, it's just typical French. I mean, if they're unhappy about anything, they do a blockade for everything. It's just typical of their national, of stamping their feet and usually getting things sorted. But no, I think that the French were completely wrong. They were well out of order, and they need to get their own act sorted. They need to do the paperwork, and you know, they can't complain at anybody if they're late.
Okay, I mean, the French might take issue with that characterisation, although I dare say. I mean, what they're saying is that there are new conditions have been attached to those licences which they didn't know about. That's the main gist of their gripe. Deborah.
Well, I have to say, I wish Boris Johnson would stop getting up in the morning and thinking, how can I pretend to be Churchill today? And I just feel like it's very childish, but also I just think the public of both countries would like their politicians to be grown up and not say, well, I'm going to cut your electricity off then. Well, fine, I'm going to send a gunboat, because we're not children. Well, we're not children. I think sometimes that's their first response, and it's disappointing to the public. It's clearly disappointing to everybody here.
John, you want to come back in?
Well, I think there's an important point here. It isn't a question of people not filling in forms that they knew they had to complete. What is at stake is an argument about the behaviour of the Jersey authorities and more particularly the British government in surreptitiously introducing new regulatory burdens and compliance requirements with minimal notice, of which the French fishermen couldn't possibly previously have been aware.
I mean, Jersey obviously disputes that, John.
And that, well, it's certainly a violation of the principles and the intended application of the trade agreement. That's the first thing. The other thing is, in a sense, a backhanded compliment to Robert, whom I served with in the House for 5 years and more. It is remarkable how, through the deployment of his mellifluous tones, he can talk about solving a problem when solving a problem means the betrayal of the British fishing industry and its decimation on the one hand, and, frankly, the denial of the rights, very long established over decades and more, of French fishermen. These people aren't newcomers. They're not new kids on the block. They're not people suddenly turning up and saying, can we fish here? This is an area in which customarily they did fish. And all I would say, Robert, is looking to the future and very much agreeing with Deborah, if we're going to make progress, we don't do it by picking juvenile fights, not just with one country, but with the entirety of the European Union. If we want to choreograph decent, constructive, convivial relations for the future, let's start as we mean to go on, rather than adopting gunboat diplomacy and then getting some dovish spokesman to appear and say, well, we know we've deployed the boats, but actually we mean well after all. I'm afraid it doesn't wash because it isn't consistent. And on reflection, I think people of reasonable sense and judgment can see through it.
I mean, the last time the British Navy took...
Can I just reply to John there? I mean, John now appears as the champion of the fishing communities of the British Isles, but the point of Brexit, or one of the things that it achieved, is to enable us to be, once again, an independent coastal state with greater control over who fishes in our waters, greater control over the destiny of those industries.
But the Scottish Fishermen's Federation calls the UK-EU trade deal on fishing desperately poor. It says it leaves them in a worse situation than before.
If Brexit's been put to bed, Robert, it's got up again. And it's got out of bed, it's running around, it's not put to bed at all. You need to put Brexit back to bed.
I don't think that's fair. inevitably, an enormous change like Brexit will leave some things that need to be ironed out. That's what's going to happen now.
That's what you should put on the bus. Inevitably.
In fairness to John, it will require diplomacy and good relations with our neighbours. We all want to see that because we want to move forward. These are our European friends and neighbours and our trading partners. We want to build the best possible relationship. But, you know, it does a bit stick in the teeth hearing that from people with the best will in the world, like John, like Thangam, who did their best to make this issue such a divisive and bitter one for so long.
Oh, for goodness sake.
Voting against, in Thangam's case, voting against getting Brexit done dozens and dozens of times, I think 40-odd times. John obviously sat in the chair using every device and an opportunity he could to make
it's
it more
called standing
difficult.
up for the rights of the democratic legislature, Robert. I'll introduce you to the concept, and a tutorial on the subject would be of great advantage to members of Her Majesty's government.
Some people are applauding there, some people are shaking their heads. And Amanda, you're laughing, I can see. Right, OK. We could talk about this for some time. I'm going to move on because there's other questions I want to get in. We're going to hear now from Liz Carmichael. Liz.
Would a Labour defeat in Hartlepool and elsewhere in the Red Wall areas mean curtains for Keir?
And whether they're John Lewis curtains or other kinds of curtains. Thangam.
I mean, first of all, if we're going to talk about curtains, I did find it quite extraordinary that anybody actually looks down on John Lewis curtains. Yeah. I thought that was the height of aspiration. But I think it's far too early in the day for us to say what's going to happen either in Hartlepool or any of the other seats.
It is too early, but nonetheless, it's looking like you've got a real fight on your hands.
There. And every vote we have fought for, we have worked incredibly hard. We've got fantastic candidates across the country, in Hartlepool, but also in the local elections, in the Metro Mayors. I've been around the country. I've spoken to voters in Hartlepool, in the Rhondda Valley, and all over the country. People have been listening to the Labour Party, been willing to talk to us. And
but what's the answer to Liz's question?
It's too many hypotheticals for me to be able to answer.
Well, they're not. Well, OK, yes. Let's deal with one. Let's take one issue. Would a Labour defeat in Hartlepool mean curtains for Keir?
Well, it's far too early to say. And at the moment, we need to wait and see what the results are. We also need to see what the
polling's not been looking encouraging, by and large, has it?
But you wouldn't want to base an entire decision on one result. There are a whole load of results going to be taking place over the next few days. We've worked hard, and I think that it behoves us all in the Labour Party to continue to listen very carefully to what the voters are saying. Whatever they say, whatever we get to at the end of today, which is you know, it's not clear yet, I think it's important that people have moved away from the disaster that was the 2019 general election and are willing to take another look at Labour, are willing to listen to what...
Well, I guess you'll find out.
We will.
Hugh.
Well, I think that in a democracy, every government needs a strong opposition. And, that's good for democracy. And we have not got a strong opposition at the moment. And I think that is a disaster. And I myself, I actually don't know what Labour really stands for at the moment. It certainly doesn't seem to stand for standing up for the young, hardworking people who have been most affected by lockdowns and the underprivileged, its traditional voter base. They just don't seem to have made any noise about that. We know that young people and the poorest in society have been absolutely the most affected by lockdown, the most affected by COVID. I don't see Labour making any noise about that at all or doing anything useful in that regard. And I think that's disappointing. I don't know what they stand for. I'd like to see them much stronger with very clear views and clear policies, but I don't know what their policies are anymore.
I mean, I have to respectfully disagree, and I think Robert will bear witness to the fact that we've disagreed on many things. Robert and I have disagreed over the dispatch box. I mean, I think we have stood up for people. For instance, we've stood up for people on school meals. We stood up and got a reversal of a decision of the government. We stood up for people on the evictions ban, which is something that Robert and I have debated. We stood up for people on cladding, which is so important to so many people across the country. We are standing up for people right now when we do not want to see the economic devastation that would arise if the government chooses to go out, carry on with its decision to cut universal credit by a whopping 30 quid each week, which will make a very big difference to a lot of working people. We've managed to achieve quite a lot of U-turns out of the government, not enough. I'd still like Robert to go further, particularly, for instance, on cladding. But I still think that it's not fair to say that we haven't stood up to the government. I think Robert would bear testimony to the fact that we've disagreed on many an occasion.
I mean, interesting that you don't say no to Liz's question. Would a Labour defeat mean curtains for Keir? Because obviously no would mean he's the leader, he stays on, but maybe his position is not that secure.
No, I mean, I think that Keir's had an absolute mountain to climb over the last year, and it's been a very, very long year. It's been difficult for everybody. It's been a hard year for everybody, and I think that one of the things we've learnt in this election is people are willing to listen to Labour again, are willing to talk to us, and we'll see what the results are like over the next few days.
What does our audience think? Brian?
I think it's been very clear over the last couple of years is that the Labour Party is facing a real battle for identity. Following Jeremy Corbyn's resignation as leader, I think we've seen Labour Party under Keir Starmer really trying to reinvent themselves. And young person, I really want to see Labour try and convince me and really try to show me that they stand for things and really show me that they're someone who I can put my faith and trust in. The Labour Party is a party which I've always wanted to believe in and always wanted to trust in. But I think they need to convince, especially young voters like myself, that they really are standing up for us.
And what could they say, Ryan, to convince you?
To be honest, I just want a vision of some sort. So whether that's on how they can make housing affordable, how they have a plan for effective spending, which can really help to alleviate poverty within the UK. Just measures which they can really put in place to safeguard the long-term future of not only myself, but people who will come after myself.
Okay, Bethany.
I would really like to echo a lot of what Ryan said. I'm a Labour member and voter, and I feel quite apathetic in the most recent elections. It was hard to go out and vote even because I just didn't know what I was voting for. So I didn't have clear policies. The vision isn't there. I think would make a better future weren't there.
Okay, Tony?
Yes, I'm just wondering if the Conservatives were to gain seats in Hartlepool and in particular in Scotland, would that indicate that the public are more interested in healthcare, education and jobs rather than the rhetoric of Scotland's First Minister and the price of a roll of wallpaper?
Deborah?
Yeah, honestly, I really want to like Keir Starmer, and he's my MP, and I want this vision. I feel really disappointed that his first response to the policing bill was we abstain. And I know
we voted against it, Deborah.
But his first response...
No, we voted against it.
Was his first response not, we're going to abstain?
No, we voted against it. I'm in the shadow cabinet.
Because it definitely said that in the papers.
Well, I'm sure that everything in the papers is true, Deborah.
Well, I mean, he certainly didn't come out with guns blazing. I'm not really hearing from him. There's a clause in the policing bill that says if you are noisy and annoying at a protest,
and we voted against it.
But I'm not feeling the heat. I'm not feeling the rage about that because the definition of a protest is to be noisy and annoying. And I can't afford to be criminalised. I can't afford to go to jail.
So Labour voting against it was not enough for you?
No, I feel like he wasn't outraged. He didn't come out and go, this is appalling. He hasn't talked in those... his first response was not to say, this cannot stand. All the people going out with Kill the Bill, I don't feel like he's really with us. But I want him to listen, and I feel like maybe he will. I think on the upside, he seems like a statesperson. He seems like a grown-up. Like he brushes his hair before he does speeches. That's an appeal for me. As opposed to our current Prime Minister. He looks like a grown-up, right?
I mean, that is setting the bar pretty low, is that hairbrushing.
This is where we are, Fiona, at the bottom of the barrel, and we've got to start from here and build up. I mean, if you ask me now, would I rather have Keir Starmer be Prime Minister or Boris Johnson? Of course, Keir Starmer, yes, absolutely, please, give it to me now. But I would love to see more from him on Black Lives Matter. I'd love to see more from him on really going out and being an opposition. But I do value that he doesn't oppose things that shouldn't be opposed just for the sake of opposing them.
Robert, I'll come back to you, Thang.
Well, look, we don't yet know what the outcome's going to be in Hartlepool, and it would be...
But are you feeling pretty chipper?
Well, I think it would be pretty extraordinary for an election like Hartlepool even to be close in historical terms, because governments don't usually win seats off the opposition. In fact, it's quite unusual for governments even to hold their own seats in by-elections.
Well, it's only happened twice.
I was elected in a by-election in 2014, and that was the first time for 25 years that the
Jenrick
Conservatives
factor.
had... Well, it were many factors, probably not me being the decisive one, but it was 25 years since we'd won one before. William Hague had been elected in 1989. So it is unusual even to be close in these situations. Having been to Hartlepool a couple of times over the course of the last few weeks, I'd say a few things. Firstly, there is a genuine desire for change. And having been represented for 57 years, I think, by a Labour MP, including some very prominent ones like Peter Mandelson, I did find people who felt not enough had happened, they hadn't been invested in and valued as much as they should have been, and wanted something different. They did look to people like Ben Houchen, who's the Conservative mayor, who's also up for re-election today, and think that they were doing a good job, and that there was investment, there's now a free port, there are good jobs coming in, taking advantage of clean energy and the highly skilled, interesting jobs of the future that are coming forward in that respect, the investment in town and high streets that we're doing in that part of the world. So they saw a positive change coming, and I think fundamentally they didn't feel that the Labour Party today represented them. And that is a real concern, I think, for Keir Starmer and for the Labour Party, because they felt that it was now a party which was solely interested in the most metropolitan parts of the country and didn't speak to mainstream opinion in the rest of the country. And that, I hope, is what we as the Conservatives are offering. I think that is a real challenge for the Labour Party.
Ariane, you've got your hand up.
I think one of the problems is that there is a lot of infighting in the Labour Party, and I would like to see a party that can give some proper vision, some proper ideas of how we're going to come out of the pandemic, not lots and lots and lots of empty promises to try and buy seats, but to try and make people's lives better. And really, was it sensible to have somebody who was a Remainer to be standing in a by-election from somewhere which was very much keen on leaving the EU? I think that was a big mistake.
Charlie?
I think we underestimate how difficult it has to be it would be any opposition leader to get themselves heard while we're going through the pandemic and coming out of it. So to judge anyone at this time, I mean, you've got to give them at least a couple of years.
John?
Well, I think people like straight answers. So let me begin by saying that although we haven't seen the outcome, I am very confident from what I've read that Labour will lose Hartlepool. And yes, that is a shock. It wasn't originally, perhaps, by commentators to be expected. It isn't really a shock to me. And the reason why it isn't a shock to me is that it is only 17 months ago that the Red Wall seats revolted against Labour and turned to the Conservatives.
Yep. And should it, in terms of the question, should that mean that Keir Starmer should go?
No, I don't think it's curtains for Keir, but I think there are two reasons why it's not such a great surprise. The first is that we've had a suspension of normal politics for the 13 months of Keir Starmer's leadership, and indeed a few days before. And in December 2019, people said they wanted to get Brexit done, and the government has delivered on the first phase of Brexit. I happen to think it's the most colossal foreign policy blunder in the post-war period, but people voted for that to happen, and it has happened. So in a sense, it would be counterintuitive and almost bizarre if voters all of a sudden said, well, we know we wanted that in significant numbers, even in Hartlepool, where Brexit Party is not standing this time, but actually we're going to punish the government that's delivered what we said we wanted them to deliver. That's the first point. And the second point is, I think you have to allow for the fact, consistent with what I've said about the suspension of normal politics, there is a wave of relief in the country at the arrival and, yes, the effective distribution of the vaccine, and a desire to reward the government. Now, the distribution is overwhelmingly about the National Health Service, and the devising of the vaccine is overwhelmingly about the quality of scientists and very little to do with the government. But nevertheless, it's been a success. So in light of those two factors, why should there be a great turnabout in opinion in such a short period? But I won't duck or burk the wider issue, Fiona, very briefly. Briefly. And what I would say is this. I think that Keir Starmer is clinical, forensic, sincere and articulate, very effective in debate in the House of Commons. But he has to be bolder, he has to reach out to and connect with and cut through to the country as a whole. I think there is a market for a left of centre party that can show how it will tackle the levelling up agenda, how it will help the left behind, the left out, the left to rot. And in that sense, sorry, but in that sense, it's very different from 1979 or even 2010, when people wanted government out of the way. People want a protective state, and a Labour Party.
John, you're familiar what it felt like to sit as Speaker of the House of Commons, to kind of Keep MPs to their time limit, allow others to speak. I'm going to do the same. Hugh, I can see you wanted to come back in.
Yes, I think I heard John saying, is it curtains for Keir? I hope there'll be John Lewis curtains. But my more serious point is I thought I'd heard every type of letter used to describe recoveries and recessions, L-shaped, V-shaped, U-shaped. But recently I've been hearing about K-shaped recovery. And what this actually means is that through COVID and through the pandemic and coming out of it, it appears that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, as a huge generalization, but it's very, very true. And what we've seen is that school children, students, young people have been absolutely sort of hammered by school closures, university closures, and so forth. And industries in which young people work, the retail industry, the hospitality industry, have also been absolutely hammered by COVID and by the recession. Who knows how many jobs will be lost in the end? But it's almost exclusively in the younger part of the market, low-paid jobs. And I would just like to see, the opposition. Well, I'd like to see the government do it, but I'd really like to see the opposition who have traditionally stood up for those people, hardworking younger people trying to make a way in life. I would like to see somebody stand up for them. And I think that that's what Labour have failed to do in the face of all the measures introduced by government. At no point have they said, we stand for these people who have actually lost out through the pandemic, which is not except rich people. It is the poor and less privileged. And Labour have done nothing on that front. And neither really Conservative.
Now, Thangam, you obviously want to respond to Hugh, but also, what about Bethany and Ryan there? Bethany, who was a Labour voter, Labour member, I think you said, Bethany, and Ryan, who wants to vote Labour, and they just can't see a way to do it. No, and then you've got Deborah here as well.
Yes, and I understand that, and I really hear what Bethany and
That must be very depressing for you.
Well, I think it's important that all politicians learn to listen to what people are saying to them when they don't agree. And that's part of what I've been doing and part of what Keir's been doing. And I have to say that a lot of the country, in my view, I think it was the majority of the country, actually wanted us to do things in the national interest for the last year and take a constructive opposition approach, which is exactly what Keir's done. He has actually, Hugh, opposed the government many, many times. We have opposed the government on any manner of things, whether it was school exam results or, as I say, it was free school meals in the holidays. We have stood up in support of people who have been losing income, particularly, for instance, those in the private rented sector, where I have called time after time for the evictions ban, and I've been very glad to have persuaded Robert that that was the right thing to do.
Well, I created it before you were a minister.
We then have
You weren't even in position when I created the executive.
I was in position from April the 5th, Robert, and my predecessor called for it the
first
first
time.
time. We
Let's not get too hung up. But the thing is, Thangam, you can list the things.
Yes.
But when you've got people saying either Hugh say maybe Hugh never would vote Labour, but I suspect not Hugh, but saying I'm just not. You have in the past. Well, that's good to know. It's just not cutting through to him. You've got Bethany saying I want a vision, Ryan saying I want a vision. Yeah. So you can list these things, but certainly to some people, at any rate, that's just not coming across.
I completely get that. Now, I know that Keir has a vision for making this country the best country to grow up in, the best country to grow old in. I know that we want to rebuild our economy. I know that we want to build a better country to grow old and grow up in. I have ideas about how we can do that, for instance, on the housing agenda. And I also know that we've got a great team who cannot wait to be able to cut through more, and I hear what people are saying, that it's not cutting through. I get that. I think that's a lesson for the Labour Party which we're going to have to take into account.
Let's take another question from Andrea McSherry.
Thanks, Fiona. Are we moving too slow with reopening hospitality? Should pubs and restaurants be able to fully open now?
Well, obviously, Hugh, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Well, as people will know, we've been fighting very hard to try to achieve this, and it was very disappointing that on the day when we received the High Court decision that the case was academic because there wasn't time to hear it before May the 17th.
Hugh, just everyone may not be familiar with the court case, so just in the very briefest outline, just remind everybody what it was you were trying to do.
Apologies. We were seeking a judicial review of the decision to delay the opening of hospitality. And as I say, unfortunately, after an unexplained 2-week delay from the court, the judgment was that it was academic because it wouldn't make a difference before the 17th of May. And I can tell you it's absolutely not academic for the 3 million people who work in hospitality. And on the very same day after the court made its decision, and it came out afterwards, there was published quietly by the government a full report from SAGE that was based on UK information throughout the epidemic that said it found no evidence that pubs and restaurants or hospitality in general were significant contributors to infection. So while it was dead easy, I can understand people believing at the beginning that pubs might be a source of infection, this report by SAGE, for SAGE, of scientists said that there was absolutely no evidence of that. And they slipped it out just after the decision not to reopen. And on the back of that, and on the fact that all the data are well ahead of that predicted by Imperial and by Warwick in their models, I absolutely cannot see why hospitality is not open. And it's an immense disappointment for an industry that has spent a huge amount responding to COVID, that has lost a huge amount. And we employ like 3 million people. They're mainly under 25. And they need to get back to work. And it's a disgrace. The data and the science have at no point ever supported the government on this.
Well, just the other thing SAGE said in that same report was the data collected via contact tracing offers an opportunity to understand the environments where people spend time, but does not give definitive information on where, when and how transmission occurred. So basically what they're saying is that the system is not detailed enough for them to be able to say with any high degree of certainty exactly where people are contracting COVID, and that goes for hospitality as much as anywhere else. Andrea, you stuck your hand up as soon as you asked the question, and you're supplying food to the hospitality industry, aren't you?
Yeah, sure. So I work for a fresh produce supplier in Scotland, one of the largest in Scotland, and we are part of the supply chain to hotels and restaurants. Now, the rules are slightly different in Scotland than they are in England. In Scotland, we're allowed to serve food inside with no alcohol up until 8 p.m, which is ridiculous. What we're actually saying is, in about 10 days' time, people will be able to go to indoor concerts, up to 100 people. But what we're saying is maybe 4, adults cannot have a meal indoors and have a glass of wine with their meal, which is just ludicrous. It's absolutely crazy. And the business owners all across the UK have adapted their businesses to make sure they're safe places to go. They've worked really hard to fit in with the guidelines, and this industry is literally on its knees. Businesses are closing all over the place, and we've got to get it moving as soon as we possibly can.
Now, Robert, the government said all along that it would be driven by data, not dates. Now, the next date of opening up in England, at any rate, is May the 17th. The data is looking very favourable. Why can the government not open up sooner in hospitality?
Well, you're right that the data that we've seen is very positive. The Prime Minister has said that himself. It looks as if we will be able to move forward with the next stage of the roadmap on the 17th of May, and there's nothing at the moment that would suggest that we're not also able to move forward on the 21st of June with the next stage of the roadmap.
But to Hugh's point, why can't
I think it is right to stick to the process that we've created, because remember, the idea of our process is that you gather the data, you ensure there is a 5-week wait, which gives enough time to have the right information upon which to make an informed decision, and then you have some time to give the public and businesses like Hugh's the time it takes to prepare to reopen and restart those particular parts of the economy. No one is saying this is easy. None of us would want to have these measures in place for a day longer than is necessary. But I think it is right, having done so much, having had all these difficult decisions and privations, to be cautious at this stage in the process. We are trying to do everything we can to support in England and in the rest of the United Kingdom where we can, the hospitality sector. If you think through what we've done, we've got the business rates holiday that's continuing. We've got grants up to £18,000
yes, but they want to open
for businesses.
The fact is they just
We're
want
providing
to
money to help businesses when they can reopen. We're spending billions of pounds getting high streets and town centres up and running as well. So we're doing everything we possibly can to support those businesses through undoubtedly a very difficult and challenging period. But I think it would be doing the country a disservice now at this stage to rush rather than waiting a little bit longer. And there's nothing that we can see so far to suggest that there is going to be a delay on the next stage of the roadmap. So it is literally a question now of 10 days until most of the aspects of the economy that Hugh and others have spoken about this evening will be able to reopen.
So at the moment, only 40% of hospitality venues are able to open. certainly in England at any rate. Thangam, do you support the idea of sticking to May the 17th, or are you swayed by what Hugh is saying, that actually the data is looking so favourable now that we should open up sooner?
Well, I think it's an utter tragedy for the hospitality industry and the wider entertainment industry, creative industry and destinations that we're in the situation that we're in now. I wish that the government actually had been driven by data throughout this entire crisis. If they had, they might have heeded their own commissioned report that was published last July, warning of what might happen in the winter without certain measures taking place. If they'd done them then, maybe that would have made a difference.
But given that we are where we are, do you think that we should be opening sooner, as Hugh would dearly like to see, and Andrea, or do you think we should be sticking to May the 17th in England?
I don't have access to the same data that the government experts do, but I do think it's important that we are driven by data. I think that would have been better if we'd been driven by data earlier on. I think that would have helped the hospitality industry. But what these people are also talking about here, the suffering that's gone on with businesses, the loss to young people's jobs in particular, they haven't all been protected, unfortunately, Robert. I heard the Chancellor himself back in February say, unfortunately, we can't protect every business. We haven't taken an approach which has said which businesses were viable, how can we help support them, how can we help preserve those jobs, and that has not
faced
taken
with
place.
a pandemic, you cannot protect every single business and every single job.
Well, say that to the people who've lost their
but
jobs.
We have, I think, done a great deal. We've had a £400 billion programme. We've done the furlough.
Say that to the people who've lost their jobs.
Well, we all feel desperately sorry for the businesses that are
their
suffering
bills.
and the individuals who are
Doesn't
suffering.
pay the bills.
But we have done, I think, as much as almost any country in the world. And I think it's all well and good with hindsight for you to say,
No, I didn't
well,
say
we
it's about
would have
hindsight.
done something different. What would you have done differently?
I can tell you many
Chancellor has
things. Do you want
brought
me to give you a
forward
list?
probably the world's most
give you a
comprehensive
list.
package of support for people in this situation.
You've left out adequate sick pay for people being told to isolate. You've left people who can't afford to take time off work when they've been told to isolate without adequate compensation. Many businesses, what about the 3 million self-employed and limited companies limited by guarantee
Well,
who haven't been able to pay?
We have provided support for the self-employed.
No, you know that there's been
we have
so
provided
much.
payments for people
There's been
who
so
need
many
to
people who
self-isolate.
haven't been able to do. You know that isn't. You know there've been many people who haven't been able to afford to do that. You know that.
Fiona, the adage that we should be driven by data and not dates has tragically been turned upon its head, because in this case, as has been eloquently explained by Hugh, the reality is that we have been driven, or at least the government has doggedly and dogmatically been driven by dates, irrespective of the emerging data. I think it is a minor but significant scandal that the SAGE report was eked out at the last minute after the conclusion of the case. And although Hugh has put his point very forcefully, I think it should be emphasised that really Hugh and his colleague lost the case essentially on a technicality about the unavailability of sufficient time to determine the matter before the 17th of May. And what I say to Robert is none of the facts that you've adduced about government support programmes is going at this moment to be disputed by me. But what I would very politely say to you, Robert, looking at it in human terms rather than government statistical service terms, is this. The sector's got 3 million people working in it. It owes £2,000 million in unpaid rent that at the moment it can't pay. And it's losing £200 million, not a week, not a month, not a year. It's losing £200 million a day. So the proposition that I put to you is that while you sit in ministerial offices and reflect and cogitate on what the future might hold, businesses are going to the wall. Fiona, my own view, for what it's worth, is that one should look at these issues on a case-by-case basis. I'm extremely cautious and apply the precautionary principle on foreign holidays, which I think would be a mistake this year.
Let's not stray into that.
On this issue, I think Hugh is right, and I think the sector deserves relief and support.
Do you mind if I get to one point of fact? The reason to stick to the dates that we've talked about and why that doesn't conflict with the data not dates point is that it takes 5 weeks to gather the correct data so that you can make the most informed decision. And that's the point at which the Prime Minister, Chris Whitty, our experts, review the data in the knowledge of all the facts, make a decision, and then provide sufficient time for the sector to prepare for whatever the outcome is.
Hugh,
so that is why it's better not to rush and make a decision before you're armed with all the information.
Hugh.
Robert, I'm afraid that's just incorrect because, contrary to what was said earlier, we do have access for the data, and the roadmap, the way out of lockdown, was based on three models, three principal models: the Imperial model, the Warwick model, and I think it was the UCA model, the UCL model. And the assumptions behind those models were published, I'm pleased to say. And what we can actually see is that in all respects, the data has consistently, from the end of January, been better than those models. And for example, if we take vaccines just of themselves, which has been a tremendous achievement by the country, which is now being squandered, we can see the assumptions that were used in those models, and we can see that uptake amongst the vulnerable was much greater than the models assumed. We can see that the effectiveness at preventing infection and severe disease was much better than those models assumed. And we can see that the transmission by people who were vaccinated is much better than those models assumed. And we can also see that the number of cases has fallen faster than the models assumed, that the number of hospitalizations has fallen faster than the models assumed. So we have enough data quite clearly, and we had it a month ago, to see that the assumptions behind the models were very clearly wrong from the start, from the outset, were based on bad data. And as soon as the real world data started coming in, it proved unequivocally that those assumptions were wrong. And yet the government has not changed its position. It has not followed data rather than dates. It has been hung up on dates. And all the while, since at least April the 8th, it has been sitting on a report from SAGE saying that hospitality wasn't even responsible.
Right. Deborah.
I'm a comedian. I would love to be standing in front of a big throbbing audience having a wonderful time. But I'm also, as a dual citizen, I'm also an Australian. And they have had 900 deaths in Australia, just over 900 deaths. And they've got a population of 26 million. So commensurately, we could have had, say, 3,000 deaths here. And maybe, okay, we're very densely populated, so maybe 6,000. But what have we had? 126,000 deaths, something like that?
Over 127,000.
127,000 deaths. That's disgraceful, Robert. That's an absolute outrage. And we had this hokey-cokey lockdown of, oh, we're out and we're eating out to help out, and now we're staying in to avoid dying, and we're doing all of the confusion. And it feels like now it is relatively safe. We're locked in. But at Christmas, we were all out, when we weren't vaccinated, none of us were vaccinated, we were all out eating out to help out. I mean, it's been...
Well, Chris, we weren't eating out to help out at Christmas, it was earlier.
We weren't eating out to help out at Christmas, no, but we were let out a bit at Christmas. There was sort of business
So do you think restaurants,
restaurants,
hospitality, pubs, etc., they should open now or not?
I don't know, because I'm getting my information from this government, and they are the absolute worst. I wish I knew. Oh my God, someone please tell me. But I look at Australia and I look at New Zealand and I say it could have been done and it could have been different. And so, yes, we've done very well with vaccines. But I think people are... why are people voting for the Conservatives in Hartlepool? It's a mystery to me. They're just looking at the last bit and going, oh, we've been quickly vaccinated. Please look at everything that happened before that and is still happening. You must feel really awful about 126,000 deaths as somebody who's in the cabinet. You must do, Robert, surely.
Well, no, every death is one too many. But I think the point we are at now, you're almost making the argument, I think, for the government's roadmap, is that people want certainty. They want a roadmap they can have confidence in, and that is what the roadmap is providing. We've managed to achieve it so far, thanks to the success of the vaccine programme. 35 million people have now had their first jab, but there's still 18 million adults in this country that haven't, and that's going to take some more weeks. So I think we just need to show a degree of patience, be cautious, and let's get through the remaining stages of this.
Why do you think Australia's had 900 deaths? I mean, that's such a huge disparity. 900, 127,000, 900.
127 plus.
I think there are many different reasons why countries have responded differently. Now isn't the right time for us to be making those comparisons. They've actually not proven very good comparisons in the past. We've had these
just out of interest, when is the right
previously.
time, Robert, do you think?
Well, once we're through the pandemic.
But when it's too late to learn the lessons, wouldn't it be a good idea
well,
to
we're
have the
learning lessons,
inquiry now?
all the time.
Well, it doesn't look that way, does it?
If your point is let's hold an inquiry, let's do that once we are through this. Thangam. The government is focused on the vaccine programme, recovery post-pandemic, sustaining people's jobs.
Those businesses are going to be out.
Tackling the backlog in the health service and in public services. That is what the public want the government to be focused on right now.
Stop and start.
We are
back and forward. One thing.
Okay, but you're arguing for the opposite, John.
You are constantly
you're saying deviate from the roadmap. You're saying,
what I'm saying is
chop and
follow
change.
the
Don't
science.
talk at the same time, or no one will hear either of you.
You don't even want to wait until 5 weeks to see the science.
Not by an arbitrary... Well, Robert is chuntering from a sedentary position in evident disapproval of the thrust of the point that I'm making, but the reality of the matter is that the government has stopped and started, gone hither and yon, broken its promises, misled people, 1 minute making one commitment, the next minute the next. It has been a catalogue of ineptitude on an industrial scale, and therefore I can well understand, Robert, why you are fighting shy of a full public inquiry. But a full public inquiry there should be, a full public inquiry there will be, and when that full public inquiry takes place, we will see an unsparing spotlight on just how much has been done so badly over such a short period to the huge detriment of the people of this country.
I am going to move on because we haven't got much time left, and I want to get one more question in, which quite a few people wanted to speak about. Charlie.
Hi. Just quickly, do you think that the pitch invasions by the fans at Manchester United will contribute to a change of power towards fans, or will they ultimately be ignored?
Robert.
Well, look, the government acted very swiftly when the plans came forward by the bosses and the owners of the big clubs to create the European Super League. I think that was absolutely right. It goes against all the spirit of the game. It would have destroyed the game. And so
should fans have more power now?
I think fans absolutely should do. We're doing a review led by Tracy Crouch, who John and Thangam and others will know is one of the most independent-minded members of Parliament. I hope she comes forward with some very serious proposals. I'm sure she will do. She's been thinking about this for a long time, and I've got confidence the government will take forward those proposals, because we do need now, I think, a shift in the fundamental power dynamic in the game, away from these big international billionaires back to the fans, because football is part of our heritage, our culture, whether that's the biggest clubs or smaller ones.
And will the government actually have the power to make that happen, or will you just talk about it?
Well, there's a lot of things that the government can do. We can pass laws, we can regulate the game more, and you saw, I think, from the decisive action the Prime Minister and the Culture Secretary took immediately when the proposals were brought forward, that actually we do have the power to intervene and to make things happen. And I'm very pleased that we killed that proposal. And I hope that we can use this as an opportunity to make the game more dynamic, more democratic, and more in the interest of the fans, who ultimately, that's what the game's all about.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very glad that the government has finally heeded the call of my colleague Rosanna Allen-Khan, who, when she was Shadow Minister of Sport some time ago, actually called for a fan-led review. We have been calling for many a long year for fans to be in charge of what happens in their clubs, as they are in other countries. I think we need to see this actually followed through now, not just it be a convenient soundbite at a time during an election period. It's got to be followed through. Hugh?
Well, look, I'm not an expert at football, but for some years the dynamics in top sport have been changing very dramatically, so that the money that flows into these clubs, rather than coming from the immediate fans in person, has moved far more towards the media rights, sponsorship rights, and all these other rights that they manage to sell, and this has become a much more important source of income for all these clubs than the fans themselves. And so, in a sense, something like this was always bound to happen. And I think it's good that it's come to a head now, because the people, both the players, the managers, the owners of these clubs, they need always to remember that ultimately they are dependent on the fans. They're there to play sport, but they're also there to entertain. And I'm actually pleased that it's come to a crunch, but I think it's been coming for some time because of the move away from what you take on the gate towards all the media rights. So I think it's a good thing, and it'll actually end up being better for football, I hope, even though it's been a sad episode.
Let's hear from the audience. Carlos.
I'm not a football fan, but I certainly celebrate any shift of power to the people. But what shocked me was hearing the Prime Minister say that he understood that anger. Why doesn't he understand the anger behind the Me Too movement, or even anger over the Northern Ireland Protocol? I was shocked that he actually didn't just blanket disapprove of the violence.
Okay. Richard?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. It's never going to happen. There's too much money in football. The people who own the clubs have got so much money, the people who sponsor it have so much money. If fan power really wants to happen, these big boys need to go off and play in their Super League in Europe, and FC United of Manchester's and teams like that need to be recreated, where fans can really have an association with the players who play for them. Because as it stands now, not a chance, too much money, and can we really see it coming back? I don't think so.
Deborah? Look, honestly, my main reference for football is Ted Lasso, Football is Life. But what I will say, though, is that I've loved seeing British people so politically engaged, and it is politics. You know, there is a sense of power, power to the people, and they got something shifted, and I just wish we would all engage that way, because I understand how important football is to people, and it really, really is. And I'm not implying for 1 second that the NHS and housing and schooling is as important as football, because I don't want hate tweets, but it is up there surely, and wouldn't it be great if people were as engaged or more engaged about those things, because it clearly works. The European Super League died to death, as far as I could make out on Twitter, because the people didn't want it. What else could we ask for if we went to this government and said, we're not having it? Becky?
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting point for the Tory minister to make, in that there needs to be a shift in power. And yet there's so many other examples of where there does need to be a shift in power. So I just wonder how you feel that is possible when the rights of people to be able to protest is being attacked. Well,
Robert, if I have time, I'll come back to you on that. John, I need to let you answer this question. I mean, is there any way, do you think, that the kind of German model could be seen here, where the fans are the majority shareholders in a club?
Yes, it could be, and I'm glad you're familiar with the German model, Fiona. I think it's a commendable one, and I look forward with interest and anticipation to what Tracy Crouch in her review finds. I agree with Robert. I think she's a very serious-minded and independently focused person, and she'll come up with what she thinks is best. Frankly, I think that the very principle of competitive sport was brutally violated by these big billionaires meeting in solemn and conspiratorial conclave and plotting the takeover of the sport on the basis you pay your admin fee, you get admitted, and you never get.
But let's not forget that some of these big. Let's not
outrage.
forget that some of these big billionaire owners are the ones who've stumped up the money for some of the star players.
Yes, that's a rather sore point as far as I'm concerned, Fiona, because I speak as an Arsenal season ticket holder. I was interviewed on Arsenal Fan TV a fortnight ago at the Emirates, and my particular bugbear is that if you are going to have billionaires involved, and I would like to see much greater fan control, it would be a good start if those people cared a flying flamingo about the sport of football. And the problem, I'm afraid, at Arsenal with Stan Kroenke, whose temerity, whose audacity, whose cheek, whose sheer chutzpah beggar belief, is that he doesn't know one end of a football pitch from another. The guy's based in the United States. He hardly ever comes to the UK. And my message to him is the same as Ian Wright's. Stan Kroenke, get out of our club. Let's have the club back for the fans. And I admire in other clubs people who've stood up to be counted. I hugely admire Jurgen Klopp and Ian Wright and Gary Neville and the rest. They've led, the fans have put up a terrific protest, and this time, this protest must persist until it prevails. And as Robert said, government does have power, and wouldn't it be a good thing if this time round it used that power for the benefit of the public as a whole?
Our hour is up. Football is something we could talk about for a long time. It's talked a lot in my own household, I have to say. But our time is up. Ryan, I could see you were desperate to get in, so forgive me, we're out of time. I could see your hand waving there. Listen, thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Hugh, thank you for joining us down the line. To our QT50, thank you very much. Good to see you all again, and the two new faces. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching. See you next time from Question Time. Bye-bye.